Right, guys, so we've got to the main man, my favourite monarch, Henry VIII. Okay, now I know to some he was a tyrant, he was a womanizer, he destroyed England at the time, he was war hungry, but there's something about him which I just think is amazing. Okay, and he changed England forever. So, as usual, I'll try and make this a bit quicker than the Henry VII one, and please ask any questions that you might have. So let's get rid of this. And go back here. So a little bit of background about Henry VIII. Okay, so within weeks of becoming king, he marries his brother's widow, Catherine of Aragon. Okay, remember Catherine had married Arthur, and this is the excuse that Henry eventually uses to try and get out of the marriage and get a divorce. He says that in the Bible it states that a brother should not marry his brother's widow. Secondly, when he first comes to the throne, his heir was actually Margaret, Queen of Scots. Okay, now Margaret, Queen of Scots, obviously her husband was James IV of Scotland. Now there had been so much animosity between Scotland and England. Think back to Henry VII in the last lesson, and almost before that as well. Now, what made Henry even more desperate for a son was the fact that Margaret and James then had an heir. They had a son called James, and so now there was a clear line of succession on that side. So Henry was desperate to have a son of his own to stop the crown going to his sister Margaret and her husband James. So unfortunately, Henry's first son, the Duke of Cornwall, died only 2 months old, and we think that Catherine, spelled with a K there's a K and a C, depending on where you read, had at least 3 other miscarriages. Finally, in 1516, the first surviving child was born, Mary. Now, she would be, when she took the throne, she was the last female heir to the throne since 1135. So it just shows how much importance the people in the Middle Ages put on having a male heir. Few people don't know that, or know this next bit, that Henry had an illegitimate son called Henry Fitzroy, who he acknowledges later in the boy's life as a young boy. So that illegitimate son, there was kind of no question that this Henry Fitzroy could be the next king because he was born out of wedlock during an affair. So by 1525, Henry wanted a divorce from Catherine, and he stated that the law of God had been broken because he had married his brother's wife. So in 1534, he was not granted a divorce by the Pope. Okay, and we'll look at why in a second. There's a lot going on with the Lutheran Reformation. So in 1534, Henry makes himself head of the new Church of England. Now remember, England had been strongly Catholic for centuries. Okay, now Henry was not suddenly a Protestant because of this new movement coming over from Europe under Luther. Okay, in fact, Henry hated Luther and said that he wanted to have him killed. And also, Henry was not simply now a Protestant, and England did not become a Protestant country overnight. The majority of the Catholic sentiment remained in England. It was more an excuse to create a new church, to get himself a divorce, and to start dissolving the monasteries and taking the money from them. So in 1536, 2 years later, Henry starts the dissolution of the monasteries. So under the support of his biggest advisor, Thomas Cromwell. So the dissolution of the monasteries was basically closing them down, taking the lead off the roof, taking anything that had any sort of wealth, and closing the monasteries and taking that money for himself, okay, to hopefully fund a war against France. Now, obviously, the monastery itself was not only the central point of the Catholic Church in that area, it was also where people went for medicine, to seek refuge if they were poor and in poverty, if they were sick and unwell. The monastery was the central point of the whole village, the whole town, not just about religion and a church service once a week. Okay, so that's why people felt so strongly about what Henry had done. Was not really, they weren't as bothered by the fact that they now had to disassociate themselves with the Pope and swear an oath of loyalty to Henry. They were more bothered about what was happening to their local monastery and local church. So in 1536, the same year, Henry announces the 10 Articles. Okay, so this is basically what his new faith will be based around. Now, again, a lot of it, the majority of it, was based around the Catholic traditions, but there's a few very key things that changed. The first thing is he banned the worship of images. Okay, so this again upset a lot of Catholics. He denied that it was possible for prayers to save the souls of people in purgatory. So the idea that Catholics believe that they have to follow a very strict, stringent way of life in order to get to heaven. Now, purgatory was somewhere where the souls went of people before they reached heaven, dependent on the sort of life they had. And people that were alive could pray for their souls to go from purgatory to heaven. And Henry has said that that was not possible. Okay, so again, to hear that your new head of church does not believe that, that had a massive effect on a lot of Catholics. And he also reduced the number of sacraments. You can see there in brackets from 7 to 3. Again, the sacraments are the things that Catholics believe they have to do and follow in order to reach heaven. So by this point, when Henry had fallen in love with Anne Boleyn, and there's rumours that Anne was already pregnant. Usually when Henry asked the Pope for a divorce, people think that potentially he could have allowed it. But at the time, you've got to bear in mind that the Reformation was a much bigger problem across Europe. It wasn't just this idea of the Pope allowing one marriage for Henry to be divorced. There was a much bigger problem as this idea of Lutheranism and Protestantism spread across Europe. So in that time of European politics and people fearing this new religion, the Pope simply said no. It's also worth mentioning at this time that we do know it's worth reading the number of affairs that we think Henry had. Okay, it's unbelievable. It goes on like a shopping list. Okay, and Henry had apparently already slept with Anne's sister Joanna. What makes this story even more incredible is Joanna had only visited England for 3 weeks. Yet in those 3 weeks, Henry had done the deed and now fallen in love with her sister and was about to marry her. So in 1533, he finally marries Anne Boleyn and they have Elizabeth. So because Mary was now an illegitimate child, because the marriage with her mother has now been over, she is removed as the next line as heir, and instead Elizabeth is put in the next line to heir as the Act of Succession in 1534. So Mary is removed and Elizabeth becomes the next heir. In 1536, Henry clearly gets bored because Anne cannot bear him a son. So in 1536, she is beheaded. And the second Act of Succession comes in 1536. Now that makes not only Mary illegitimate, but also Elizabeth and Henry. And what this Act of Succession says was that Jane Seymour, any children that she has with Henry, will become the new heir and not Mary, Elizabeth, or Henry. Okay, Jane Seymour had a track record for producing boys. And lo and behold, 1537, Edward was born. Okay, now in 1544, Mary and Elizabeth are reinstated as heirs after Edward. Now, that all might sound very confusing. The reason why I've done that in all one big lump sum is because if you look at the dates and maybe write these down of what happened when, and then when you come to the rebellions under Henry, you can understand why at different times people wanted a change in the line of succession or a change in religion, okay, because of what was going on in the wider picture. So 1525, pretty much a purely economic cause of this rebellion. So Henry wanted £800,000 of a new tax. Okay, this was an absolutely huge sum in the form of a forced loan. Now, what made this worse is this was not ordered by Parliament, and this was purely to fund his invasion of France. What made this even more difficult for people to take was the fact that it had followed an earlier sum of money that was demanded. So a loan of £250,000 had been raised just 3 years earlier. And what made it again even more difficult pill to swallow for the people was that that loan of £250,000 had not yet been repaid at all. So 4 subsidies across 4 years had been granted by Parliament, and the amicable grant was on top of all this. Now bear in mind, because of things like poor harvests and a whole range of different things in the north, people simply did not have that money to pay. This was a forced loan ordered by Wolsey. Now, Wolsey will talk about in a bit more detail as Henry's chief advisor. Now, the final thing there, you can see unemployment in the affected areas was on a very, very sharp rise, and inflation was also rising. So inflation is where the price of food and goods increases, but not at the same rate as the rise in wages. So it costs more money to get what you normally get, which means that people, in reaction to this, the sellers up their prices, the farmers up their prices, and so then people simply can't afford to buy food. Okay, so that means you can see there at the bottom, there's a 12% fall in the actual income of peasants, yet prices went up about to 60%. So people simply could not afford to feed themselves. So the outcome of this is they basically refuse to pay it in certain counties, and Wolsey is forced to back down, and Henry has to abandon his aggressive foreign policy, especially against France. The ringleaders, however, who were against the amicable grant, the ones who organised it, were put before the Star Chamber. Remember, the Star Chamber was brought in by Henry VII to punish people and fine people, but Henry shows his slightly more lenient side and pardons them. Henry cleverly here puts all the blame on Wolsey. Okay, Wolsey is soon to be replaced in the next sort of 4 or 5 years, and this is sort of like his first step to his fall. And now you can see there, this was a change in policy. Henry now wants to collect more tax from the rich and less from the peasantry. So in a way, Henry does learn some lessons from this. One that I told you to stay clear of, but I'm going to talk you through it briefly, is an Irish rebellion called Silken Thomas in 1534. So a little bit of background, because I know some people might want to delve into Ireland in their essay, and that's absolutely fine. I just said in the last couple of lessons, I've said that it does get a bit complicated, so you might want to do some more research before thinking about how it links into your essay. So the Irish have been run by the Anglo-Irish for hundreds and hundreds of years. Okay, the Anglo-Irish were those English invaders, or those that invaded England from other places and married into the Gaelic clans. Okay, now these families, who were the original families, became very, very powerful. The most powerful was the Fitzgeralds, and the Fitzgeralds had become the Earls of Kildare. Okay, now they were the most powerful family and noblemen in the whole of Ireland. Now, remember, think back to last lesson. Richard III, before Henry VII, had let Ireland pretty much run themselves, and the Earls of Kildare had almost run Ireland by themselves. Now, Cromwell did not want one family to have complete control. So what he did is he brought in some small policies which try to basically stop one family becoming too powerful. Now, it wasn't meant as a direct attack against the Earl of Kildare or the Earls of Kildare, the family, but that's how it was taken. So in reaction to this, which we'll look at in a minute, the Fitzgerald, in particular Earl of Kildare, steps down from the Privy Council, and I'll talk in a second about why that was seen as a bit of a slap in the face to Henry. So firstly, there was political causes. Okay, Ireland hated the idea of being controlled from London in England. Okay, they had their own way of law, they had their own courts, they had their own parts of Parliament. They wanted to run things by themselves, and they hated the idea of this power coming from England telling them what to do. The Kildare family felt they were losing their grip to their rivals because of what Cromwell had brought in. And also, think again, it's 1534. There's so much religious change. The Irish were strictly Catholic, and they did not want this spread of Protestantism to come across. However, because of this, it has been called a religious rebellion as well. The reason is that Silken Thomas, when he tried to gain an army, he calls it a Catholic crusade. The truth is, it was more politically motivated than religious, but we have to show that it could have been dual cause. So what happened? The Earl of Kildare resigned from the Privy Council. Now, you might wonder, well, why does that matter? Well, to Henry, he wants the most powerful people in England and Ireland on his Privy Council, and to him, it's an honour that he's asked them to be on it because he's given them power on how to run the country. So when Kildare resigns without giving Henry the option, Henry brings him to the Tower of London as a punishment. So the Earl of Kildare is now in the Tower of London. So his son, Silken Thomas, proclaims an uprising called a Catholic Crusade. And what he asked the people of Ireland to do is to swear loyalty to him as their leader and the Pope, and not Henry. Remember, in the Act of Supremacy, Henry asked all his followers to make him the head of the church and not the Pope. He raised an army of about 1,000 people and invaded a place called Palk, and Palk is an English-controlled area of Dublin. Henry sent one of the largest armies to Ireland that anyone had sent for decades, 2,500 soldiers. When the rebels heard about this, they pretty much gave up, and Henry said, in true Henry VIII style, that he would spare Silken's life if he surrendered, and he did. So instead, Henry executed him. So now the biggest one that you need to spend most time on, the Pilgrimage of Grace. The reason why the Pilgrimage of Grace is so important is because A, it shows all three major causes. Secondly, it's the largest in terms of number and also long in terms of duration, but also the different parts of the country that uprise and the sheer size of discontent show that this has potential to be very, very severe. So the first thing is there was economic causes. The gap between the north and south with regards to poverty was growing more and more. Okay, the majority of trade was now going through London and the south of England, so the north were getting poorer and poorer. On top of that, the population had increased since Henry VII by nearly 15%. There was more mouths to feed, plus inflation meant that people simply were going beyond struggle and were now in poverty. Landowners at this time were now also changing the way they work the land. They were no longer employing loads of people, labourers, to work and plant crops. Instead, they were turning more towards sheep farming, also known as enclosing. So instead of having, 8 or 9 different fields with labourers working on them, they'd put a hedge around each field, put sheep in there, and they were pretty much self-sufficient, and they could also get profit for the goods from the wool, and also they didn't have to pay the labourers anymore. The problem with this was it had always been accepted in Tudor times that there was something called common land. Common land was land that was not controlled necessarily by anybody. Okay, it was common land for the commoners. Now, if you were a peasant in those days, it meant that you could maybe keep one pig on that bit of land and maybe collect some firewood and whatever else might grow there. It was one of the nice things about the Tudors trying to help out the poor. The problem is the landowners in that area decided that because they were losing money, they also started to enclose that area of land that was for the common people. So again, this really, really upset, in particular, the poor. Taxes also continue to increase. Okay, the reason why a lot of people in the area, again, the landowners could increase certain bits of tax or make it more expensive to rent a house or rent somewhere to work, also a bit of land. The reason why they increased the rent was A, to try and counteract the inflation that was going on, but also a lot of them wanted to force the poor people out of their town and towards London or towards other areas. So they increased the rent, increased taxes, and forced the poor to clear off. It was all made so much worse in 1535, compounded by a poor harvest. So again, on top of inflation, on top of rising prices, on top of enclosure, you also had a poor harvest. So in the same year, a subsidy act was brought forward by Cromwell, £80,000, again to fund this war with France. So you can see now, economically, this was a major cause of the Pilgrimage of Grace. Just one more thing at the bottom there, which technically goes towards religion, but it also has, there's a reason why I put in the economy. In 1535, a huge survey is taken by Henry and Cromwell to find out just how much money is in these monasteries and in these parishes and in these different churches. And this shows Henry that all the money is tied up, or a lot of the money is tied up in these religious places of worship. So that leads to, as I said previously, the dissolution of the monasteries. Henry gets somewhere around 200 grand from this. Okay, now as I said earlier, this mattered to people. People, for them, the parish, the church, the monastery, the abbey was the centre of their world. Okay, for the local people, so they weren't as bothered about having to call Henry the head of the church rather than the Pope, but they were bothered about having the money and the whole thing basically dissolved and taken away. So you can see there an example of this is the Lincolnshire uprising took place after there was rumours that the commissioners were coming to take away their church plate. Now the church plate is not actually just one single golden plate. The church plate is the expensive metals that have religious value and financial value to that particular monastery or abbey or church. So when the rumours were rife that these commissioners were going to come and take it away, to take to Henry, to melt down, to make money, they started an uprising. And also purgatory, as we spoke about earlier, had been demoted, and they also abolished saint days and festivals. Now imagine today if like a bank holiday was taken away. The reason why people today would be angry was because a day of rest had been taken away. That wasn't the reason why people were annoyed back then. The Saints' Day that were taken away by Henry, that was so important for each church because their church was usually named after a particular saint, and they celebrated their saint on that particular day, and that meant so much to them. So to take that away was again taking away a big part of why they were so attached to that local parish. And finally, political causes. Remember, Henry had deemed Mary and Elizabeth illegitimate. So at this point, there's actually no legal heir to Henry. It can't be his son that's illegitimate, okay, because he also died the same month that this starts. Mary and Elizabeth have been removed because Henry has now divorced and beheaded their mothers. And so the North panicked. The North really panicked of England because they were now concerned that Henry would have to name his nephew, the son of James V of Scotland, heir instead. So they would do anything to make sure Mary was reinstated, okay, the eldest sister. And the final thing you might see quite a lot of, the more research you do, is the final political cause was evil counsellors. Okay, you had people like Thomas Cromwell, the chief advisor to Henry, and he gets most of the blame for these policies. The majority of rebellions are normally, especially with Henry VIII, loyal to the king. They don't want to see a removal of the king. They want to see a change or removal of his advisors because they blame them for these poor decisions and these increasing taxation, that sort of thing. Cromwell, as a little side note, was hated by pretty much all the classes. The reason why he's hated, especially by the lower classes, was because he was a self-made man. He wasn't born into power. So the nobility thought, right, well, in Tudor times, you're born into class, you're born into power. So why are you suddenly on on the big table with us? And the poorer classes were thinking that he was better than them and he shouldn't be up there. So one more thing about why Cromwell was really hated as well is he passed, or they think his idea was something called the Statute of Uses. So that basically meant that, let's say you're a nobleman or a member of the gentry with a lot of land, and you want to leave your son with that land so it stays in your family. Now, because your son is only young, instead you would give it to somebody you trust to have it, and then when your son grows up, that person will transfer the land to your son. So that was a way of getting around adding taxes and also not allowing that land to slip into the land of the crown and the king. Now they changed that so that actually there was taxation on top of that, which meant that there was no way round moving land to other people to allow your son or daughter to have it. So very quickly, what happened? The first violence took place in Lincolnshire, and they set forward a lot of demands called the Louth Manifesto. Now, this was a mixed bag of demands, you can see there. So they want an end to taxation, especially in peacetime. They can't understand why they're paying more tax even when England is not at war. They want an end to the monasteries. Okay, bear in mind that by this point, the 55 monasteries in the north, 16 had been dissolved. And you can see there, they also wanted a, sorry, there's something random on the screen now. They also wanted a pardon for the rebels who were involved. So to start, it was going quite well. The Yorkshire Rising is then led by probably the most famous rebel of this time period, Sir Robert Aske. He's the one that turns it into a peaceful, they use the word pilgrimage, that adds that religious element to this. And religious protests were all based around peace. He was smart, he was very smart, and so he sort of calmed the rebellion and made it workable for Henry and the advisors to try and come to some sort of solution. Now, what you might want to use in your essay, if you're trying to prove on the one side that this might have been caused by religion, as opposed to something like the economy, is they actually marched with the banner of the 5 wounds of Christ. Now, this shows that there was a religious motive behind what they were doing. So if they had chosen to put the banner as the 5 wounds of Christ, that shows us as historians that that must have been at the forefront of their thinking. They issue something called the 24 Articles or the Pontefract Manifesto. Now, again, I did have them all listed out, but I thought I summed it up. I found it on a website, summed it up quite nicely. 3 were economic, 6 were legal, 6 were political, and 9 were religious. Again, showing just how varied the causes were. The big mistake came by another uprising by Sir Francis Bigod, okay, in January 1537. So he was basically, he had personal grievances with the king, and he should not have started this uprising where he was, because what it did is there was communication between Sir Robert Aske and the king, so it was quite amicable. But then when Sir Francis Bigod uprises, it gives Henry the perfect chance to say that the rebels are being violent when he is not, so now he's going to absolutely crush them. So Aske and Bigod were arrested and hanged. 50 Lincolnshire rebels and 130 were executed. Now, bear in mind, you know, this was a huge rebellion with thousands and thousands of people. It's a relatively small number that were killed. And the rebellion remained entirely northern, although there was certain sympathy in the south. So Henry realised he had to focus more energy on the north. Now, this bit here, again, I don't want to take up too much time, but it's something to bear in mind. Most of you, in fact, all of you, will talk about the Pilgrimage of Grace in your coursework, okay? Like I said, for many reasons, it's the biggest, the size of it, and the causes. And what you get is there's so much research by historians. So you've got here Geoffrey Morehouse, who wrote a famous book in 2002, pointing out that it was mainly down to, you can see there, where it says the monasteries as a whole might spend no more than 5% of their income on charity, but in the north they're a great deal more generous. Doubtless because the need was greater in an area where poverty was more widespread and very real. There, they still did not. They still did much to relieve the poor and the sick. They provided shelter for the traveller, and they meant the difference between a full belly and starvation. So Geoffrey Morehouse is showing here that the main cause was economic because of the poverty, how people could not afford to survive. That's why they went on the Pilgrimage of Grace. That's why they joined the rebellion. However, Anthony Fletcher, who wrote a book called Tudor Rebellion Seminars, again, you'll use this in your essay because it's a really good book that analyses the Tudor rebellions really well, sort of disagrees slightly, and it talks about actually what happened during the rebellion. So again, you can use his work. He also talks quite a bit about religion in his book. So again, you've got a counter argument there. Derek Wilson from 1972, you can see there, it would be incorrect to view the rebellion in Yorkshire, the Pilgrimage of Grace, as purely and simply an upsurge of militant on behalf of the old religion, unpopular taxes, local and regional grievances. So again, he's showing that it was a much wider picture than simply the economy or religion. And Edward Hall in 1548, again, a bit different because he was somebody speaking at the time, looking back on this. He speaks about how it was a holy and blessed pilgrimage, and they had the Christ hanging on the cross with false signs of holiness. They tried to deceive the ignorant people. So again, he was saying that actually they made it sound like a religious rebellion when really it had ulterior motives. Now, each of these people, Okay, I've literally just picked a random 4. There are tons and tons of different historians here. Each of these people will have reasons as to why they've given this viewpoint. It could be, as I said before, where they find their research. It could be when they were speaking. For example, Geoffrey Morehouse in 2002 is going to have a lot more research from more modern era of more than Edward the Hall speaking in 1548. Okay, so it could be the time they're speaking. It could be the part of the country they live in or focus on. You know, for example, we know that Anthony Fletcher and other historians gained access to an archive in the north of England. Now, the archive in the north of England is going to have all the papers, all the acts, all the paperwork, everything from the north of England from that time period. So again, because that was hit hardest during the poor harvest and that sort of thing, it's going to look like it was mainly based around the economy, whereas other historians use the archives down in London where things weren't as bad. There's loads of reasons why the historians give different interpretations. So your homework, very similar to the other two, slight change. We're now moving on to our third monarch, which is Edward VI. So I want 2 things from you. The first thing is a fact file being made about Edward. Again, no more than a page. You must include a bit of background, his relationship with his mother, his father, his siblings, and then talk about religion. He was a very strict Protestant, and then a little bit, if you can, in the fact file about his Lord Protectors. He comes to power as a very young boy, so he has people with him who run the country for him. The 2 most famous are the Duke of Somerset and the Duke of Northumberland. So a little bit about them, just to show you're aware of it, would be fantastic. And the second thing, we're going to focus on 2 rebellions, the Western Rebellion and Kett's Rebellion. Whatever you want to send me, whether it's simple linear notes, a mind map, a podcast, a video, whatever you can create, anything, and send to me like you have with Henry VII and Henry VIII, just to show me you understand the causes and also what happened during the rebellion. Bear in mind, just a little side note, the Western Rebellion is also known as the Prayer Book Rebellion, so don't get confused, it's not 2 separate ones. And I've also included here for your fact file 2 really good websites. This one here, the top one, the Tudor Times, this is fantastic. If you want to get some good background on each rebellion or each monarch, it speaks about them really simply, but also a good amount of detail. I highly recommend that website. There's also a clip that lasts about 5 minutes about Edward, and then you can see there a couple of websites to use for the Western Rebellion and a couple of websites to use for the Kett's Rebellion. This second one here, Devon Perspectives, is a very, very detailed one, whereas this blog here on Western and Kett's is a bit more concise. Right, guys, as usual, take care, keep working. Anything I can do, please let me know. But I will speak to you again soon.